Hello, everybody, and welcome to APES Topic 2.1 Introduction to Biodiversity. So, our main goals for today is to understand that ecosystems have structure and diversity that change over time, and you need to be able to explain levels of biodiversity and their importance to ecosystems. Now, the essential knowledge we need for this portion is going to be that biodiversity in an ecosystem includes genetic, species, and habitat diversity. The more genetically diverse a population is, the better it can respond to environmental stressors. Additionally, a population bottleneck can lead to a loss of genetic diversity. Ecosystems that have a large number of species are more likely to recover from disruptions. Loss of habitat leads to a loss of specialist species, followed by a loss of generalist species. It also leads to reduced numbers of species that have large territorial requirements. And species richness refers to the number of different species found in an ecosystem. So, what is biodiversity? So, biodiversity is the diversity of life forms in an environment, and it's critical to the proper functioning of ecosystems. Higher diversity is better for both species and ecosystems. That's a key thing to remember is the more diversity, the better it is for an ecosystem, the better it is for an individual species. Now, let's start at the most basic level diversity, genetic diversity. So this is the measure of genetic variation among individuals in a population. So that implies that they're all the same species. Large populations generally have higher genetic variation. What can happen is that if there's a large loss of population, that can lead to what's called a population bottleneck. So a large population declines in numbers, and this could be due to a new predator being introduced and they overhunt a certain prey, a disease, a loss of habitat. Many different things can cause this. But for some reason, the ecosystem no longer can sustain their higher population and their population is greatly reduced. And this results in reduced biodiversity within the survivors. So biodiversity can have two different examples. So in terms of ones that are widespread, let's look at white-tailed deer. So white-tailed deer live throughout North America and South America. Within this wide geographic range, they live in many different habitats, fields, forests, swamps. As a result, the deer living in colder climates have evolved relatively large bodies to help conserve heat, and those populations living in warmer climates, like let's say Florida, have smaller bodies so that they lose heat, but they are the same species. Whereas the cheetah was a species that faced a population bottleneck. So they once roamed much of Africa and the Middle East, and researchers who have examined the amount of genetic variation in existing cheetahs have discovered that somewhere around 10,000 years ago, they experienced a population bottleneck. We don't know exactly what happened. We do believe that it was related probably to a disease that spread throughout the population. But because only a small percentage of the cheetahs survived the bottleneck, the resulting today's population has very little genetic variation, which means that their species is much more at risk for facing further decline, if not extinction. Compare that to the white-tailed deer, which is spread over a wide variety of areas, eats a lot of different foods, survives in many different ecosystems, and because of this, they have a very large diversity within their population, meaning that their population would be considered very diverse and very healthy and very more likely than other species to survive a sudden environmental change. Now, higher diversity allows populations to respond to environmental change better. For example, fish population possesses high diversity for disease resistance, and at least some individuals are likely to carry genes that allow them to survive whatever diseases move through the population. Whereas low genetic diversity means a disease would be more likely to lead to a population decline and possibly even extinction of a species. This is extraordinarily important in terms of domesticated animals and plants. And domesticated animals and plants doesn't mean just house plants and pets. It's also talking about agricultural crops. So having more genetic diversity, producing a more variety of crops, tends to be healthier because if a new disease appears, it only tends to kill one crop variety, or even just a couple crop varieties. We would still have other varieties that are resistant to the new disease, and thus we can still produce food to sustain our population. But unfortunately, many of those varieties are being lost in time as we just focus on smaller and smaller amounts of specific species. For instance, in 1900, farmers grew 8,000 varieties of apples, but more than 95% of these varieties are extinct. There are individuals and groups that are trying to preserve what they call seed heritage or crop heritage and diversity, but it's not widespread, and because of that, we only really grow roughly 20 to 30 different varieties compared to these 8,000 just 125 years ago. So again, just to revisit, high genetic diversity or high is going to lead to higher adaptive capacity and potential for long-term survival, whereas low genetic diversity means that they are not as adaptive and are less likely to survive a sudden environmental change. Now, species diversity. Let's look at what a species is. A species is a group of organisms with distinct morphology, body form and structure, behavior, biochemical properties such as RNA and DNA, and enzymes their body produces. Individuals can breed and produce viable and fertile offspring. Species diversity indicates the number of species in a region in a particular area or in a particular ecosystem. So we had talked about this earlier this year, but tundra and taigas have low species diversity. Not many species live there or can survive there even. Whereas tropical rainforests and temperate deciduous forests tend to have higher species diversity because there's more niches and more habitats within them that the different organisms can survive in. Now here we can see, we talk about species diversity, both of these communities have the same diversity. They all have these 4 different species that are marked A, B, C, and D. But as we'll see in a little bit later, these aren't exactly the same in terms of the healthiness of the communities, even though they have the same 4 species present. Now, habitat diversity. A variety of habitats that exist within an ecosystem is better for that ecosystem. It means that more animals can survive there. The more habitats there are, the more species that can be supported with shelter, with food sources, and therefore it means that more biodiversity overall for that ecosystem. Now, within these different species, we can categorize them into specialist or generalist. So specialists are species that only live under a narrow range of biotic and abiotic conditions. For example, herbivores that only consume a single plant species, like koalas, only live among eucalyptus trees and eat eucalyptus leaves. They're highly specialized. If all the eucalyptus trees were to die out or start to become extinct, their population would be immediately affected because that's their main food source and place of shelter. Whereas generalists can live under a wide range of biotic and abiotic conditions. They're much more adaptive. For example, we talked about earlier the white-tailed deer that survive in a variety of different ecosystems and eat a variety of different foods. So generalists are more likely to survive than specialists because they can handle more change in an environment and can adapt to new environments with greater ease. So usually if there is an environmental change, specialists will be the first that are impacted because they're more a smaller amount of change can actually have a larger impact on their population, whereas generalists are much less likely to be impacted. However, can also be impacted as well. Usually specialists are impacted first, and then generalists would be impacted after that. Now, when we look at habitats, remember, it's not just one giant ecosystem. There could be smaller habitats within those ecosystems. For instance, in this diagram, we could see that there's a park habitat, and a residential habitat, an agricultural habitat. You got to remember that humans influencing the environment also create habitats for these different species to survive, in addition to what we would normally say is like a natural areas, like we see here, streamside habitat and a forest habitat where animals we assume like as part of nature. But again, human influence habitat is still a habitat. So let's say a region has a mixture of farms growing crops, farms with pastures for cattle, abandoned farms with small trees and shrubs, and forests with large trees. Each of these habitats supports different specialist and generalist species, both animal and plants, fungi. The combination of the 4 habitats supports many more species. So by having them next to each other, we allow more species to survive. The more habitats within the ecosystem, the healthier it will be. As a result, the greater diversity of habitats support a greater diversity of species. Now, ecosystem diversity is going to be a variety of ecosystems that exist within a given region. For instance, along the coast of China, mixture of temperate forest ecosystems, river ecosystems, and the ocean ecosystem allows for a larger diversity of species to live in a given area. Los Angeles County, California, has the largest diversity of birds in the U.S. because they have many different habitats in that area: oak woodlands, chaparral, deserts, urban environments, and the ocean. Now, how do we quantify biodiversity? How can we say one ecosystem or one region has more biodiversity than another? So for this, we look to 2 specific categories. We look to species richness, which is the number of different species in a given area of an ecosystem, and it gives an approximate sense of the biodiversity in a given area. But it's not just the number of species, we're also looking at species evenness, which is the relative proportion of individuals within the different species in a given area. Tells us if the ecosystem is numerically dominated by one species or whether all of its species have similar abundances. So low species evenness means that one species is represented by many individuals and others only have a few individuals present, which means it's less diverse or less biodiverse. And high species evenness implies that species are all represented by similar numbers of individuals. So looking at this diagram, if we look at A and B, we're measuring species richness. Circle A only has 2 different species in it, whereas circle B has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different species that are present in the same amount of area. So species B has much higher species richness. If we look at circles C and D, we can see that they represent the same number of species. They both have the same species richness, roughly the same species richness. Yes, they do. Whereas C is heavily dominated by the species represented by the yellow squares. So even though they have the same number of different species, species C shows a lot less evenness, whereas D shows a lot where representation where there's a close to an equal number of species being represented. So let's look at another example. This is the diagram from earlier. We can see that they both have the same amount of species richness. They both have species A, B, C, and D present. But community 1 is much healthier or has much better biodiversity because the species evenness, there's a roughly equal amount or an equal distribution of the different species, whereas community 2, we can see that even though they have the same 4 species present, that ecosystem is heavily dominated by species A, whereas B, C, and D combined only make up 30% of the species in that area. So if there was a change in the environment that affected species A, community 1 would be much better suited to adapt to that change, whereas community 2 would experience a lot more change and would be many species would probably struggle to survive with that loss of species, because that one loss, like if we lose species A, is going to have a larger impact on that ecosystem. So remember, more diversity is better for a species, and it's better for an ecosystem. We get it from genetics, from genetic diversity, species diversity, and habitat diversity, and ecosystem diversity are all going to contribute to having a higher survivability.